When Ghost Recon Breakpoint was initially revealed, I was intrigued to say the least. The first trailer showed off a very heavy emphasis on elements of survival, such as an improved medical system, realistic character movement, and a prone camo function to hide from enemies. It was made clear that in this game, you are the hunted, not the hunter. All these mechanics are present in the final release, but they aren't quite used in the same way. The game begins with a chopper crash that leaves you stranded with barely any gear, and you must find your way to safety. Along the way, there are patrols that are hunting down survivors of the crash, but once you reach the hub area known as Erewhon, that feeling of fear wears off very quick. It doesn't take long before you're going on the offensive and taking down entire compounds full of enemies the same way you did in Wildlands. As much fun as there is to be had playing the game this way, I couldn't help but wonder what it would be like to play a more tactical, realistic, and immersive version of the same game. It's no secret that Breakpoint was met with controversy, mediocre reviews, and poor sales. This, however, has led to Ubisoft announcing that they're planning to essentially rebuild the game and make it more in line with what fans wanted. This includes removing the pointless RPG systems such as gear score and tiered loot, and revamping the survival mechanics to make them actually mean something. But these changes are probably a long ways off. This isn't the kind of update they can make happen overnight. But this also got me thinking, what could I do as the player in the meantime to change the experience for myself? And as it turns out, it's quite possible to drastically improve the gameplay by making some changes here and there, and showing a little bit of restraint. Provided you're willing to put in a couple of hours of effort to get everything set up, I'll show you how I made it happen. The first step to my journey was to create a new character. Once I got past the character creator and intro cutscene, I healed up my wounds and opened the settings. The first and most obvious change would be to set the game difficulty to Extreme. Compared to Wildlands, Extreme in Breakpoint is actually way more fair. You don't get laser beamed from 100 meters away by submachine guns nearly as often, but it still is very difficult, so I would have to rely heavily on stealth. If Extreme ends up being too hard though, there's no shame in bumping it down to Advanced. Next up was interface settings. This is where I'll be disabling most of the HUD elements. There are a ton of different options to change here, so I won't be going over all of them, but I'll put a link in the description to a proper list if you want to copy them. But basically everything except stamina, weapon items display, communication markers, and a few more were disabled. That means no crosshair, minimap, detection indicators, or enemy tagging either. This would make the game as immersive as possible. I would have to carefully check my corners and scout out locations before infiltrating. So now that the HUD was set up how I wanted, it was time to continue on with the game. I quickly came across my first rifle. Now this part was important, because for this run I would only allow myself to carry a single rifle, much like Ghost Mode back in Ghost Recon Wildlands. I'd have to remember not to accidentally equip a weapon in the second slot, because once you put a weapon in it, it becomes permanently occupied. So I pressed onward. After sneaking past a few patrols, and watching Walker one-tap Weaver, I finally arrived in Erewhon. Thankfully, Ubisoft is planning to eventually give the option to remove the other random players roaming around here, since, well, nothing says stranded and alone like not being stranded or alone. But for now we can just ignore them, since I would only be returning here to progress certain missions. So I talked to everybody I needed to, and then I was pretty much ready to go. But before heading back out into the world, I needed to make a couple purchases, so I headed over to Maria's shop. And don't worry, I won't be using anything in this run that requires real money. Everything here can be purchased with the standard currency, Scale credits. I bought myself a new rifle and some attachments, the most important of which was the PERK 15 laser module. Since I didn't have a crosshair, I needed a way to aim decently in third person, so this laser would help quite a bit. So I finally headed back out of the cave. First thing I did here was make sure that guided mode was disabled. This basically makes it so you don't have exact indicators telling you where to go for your missions, and instead have to follow clues to figure out the locations. But since I still had communication markers enabled, I could set my own waypoints that would appear on screen. If this kills your immersion, you can always turn them off too. But in my opinion, constantly opening the map over and over again is far less immersive than waypoints. After that, it was time to spend my first skill point. Your first skill point has you choose your starting class, so I decided to go with Panther. Each class has their own pros and cons, but for a run like this, the stealth-oriented Panther seemed like the way to go. Especially since it would help me with the next step, gathering more skill points. There's certain skills I would need to make the run viable. But before I headed out to get some skill points, I blasted through the first story mission as fast as possible, since between the alpha, 2 betas, and 3 characters in the final release, I swear I've done this damn mission at least 10 times, so I kinda just wanted to get it out of the way. After that, the fastest way to get skill points was to fly around the map in helicopters and sneak into Behemoth defense sites. Each one has 1 or 2 points in a crate by the central tower, but these things were basically impossible to fight at this point because of the leveling system, so I used my Panther cloaking spray to become invisible to them. Then, all I had to do was walk right in. Once I got the points, flew to the next site, got some more, wash, rinse, repeat. I also gathered some skill points by leveling up my Panther class a couple times. Most of the early challenges are pretty simple, so picking off patrols walking along the roads was a good way to go about it. Once I got all the points I needed, I started purchasing skills. I put a lot of thought into which skills to get and which to ignore, as I didn't want my character to become too powerful. But I also didn't want certain aspects to be too difficult. So the skills I decided on were Parachute, Night Vision, both extra perk slots, Pistolero, Resources Detection and Drone Cooldown, Ballistic Advantage, Tireless, Rations Level 2, Stamina Regen Speed, Water Filter, Slim Shadow, Sixth Sense, Breach Torch, Item Capacity 1 and 2, Shop Clearance, Close and Personal, and finally, Rocket Launcher. That was it. These were the only perks I would ever buy for this character. It seemed like a pretty good balance. I would be able to put up somewhat of a fight, but I also wouldn't become an unstoppable death machine. I topped off all my consumables, did some stretches to increase my stamina, then went to the loadout screen to assign some perks. The first was Ballistic Advantage. Without this perk, bullet drop is absurd. It's kinda necessary to make your guns useful at distance. The second was Pistolero. Since I only had one rifle, I would likely have to use my pistol way more often than usual, so the extra damage would help. And finally, Slim Shadow, which provided a flat increase to stealth, making me slightly harder to spot. Now that was all done, the last step was to grab a pair of night vision goggles. You can still use night vision without equipping one, but come on, that's no fun. So I went here to grab a pair of NVGs. Upon arriving, I realized this compound was actually pretty well guarded, so this would be my first bit of actual combat. I started picking off the guards outside as fast as I could. And somehow miraculously managed to kill them all silently, but upon entering the building, the rest heard my footsteps and came running. The AI aren't exactly what you'd call geniuses, especially in close quarters where they kinda just funnel themselves through hallways. But still, now that there was a pretty genuine threat and I couldn't see enemies through walls, I found open combat to be way more engaging. And I actually had a minor adrenaline rush, something that I've never really felt playing this game before. Eventually, I made it to the end of the compound and located the nods. Tossed them on the first helmet I found, and that was it. Setup process was complete. It took a couple of hours of effort, but in the end it was all worth it. Now that I was ready to take on the world, it was time to lay out a few more ground rules to make my life even more miserable. Number 1, no syringes. If I got injured, I'd have to deal with it the painful way by using bandages. And with the very slow health regeneration of extreme difficulty, things were about to get really tough. Number 2, no fast travel. If I needed to get somewhere, I'd have to drive or fly. And normally this wouldn't be too difficult because of the bivouacs that allow you to order vehicles. But number 3, no ordering vehicles. If I wanted a vehicle, I'd have to find one. But with the constant patrolling enemies along the roads and trails all over the island, it would probably be best to move on foot when I can anyways, at least for short distances. Helicopters would still be pretty safe overall. Number 4, no drones. Drones make scouting enemy compounds way too easy, so if I wanted to scout a location, I'd have to find a vantage point and use my binoculars. And finally, number 5. No OP consumables. This includes intel grenades, sync shot drones, and any other gadgets that turn you into an omnipresent death machine. So with all that established, it was time to head off my first real mission. First order of business was finding Josiah Hill. Intel said he was in a cabin near Dead Horse Swamp, so that was pretty easy to find. I arrived via helicopter and said what I needed to, then headed back to Erewhon to talk to Mads. Then I headed back out to find Jace Skell, the CEO of Skelltech. I figured out where Skell's estate is, and then parked the chopper on a cliffside nearby. I started moving in for a better look. I began sneaking around the back of the house, dropping a guard in the process. Then I spotted a helipad in the back with a chopper on it. I figured this would make for a good escape vehicle, so I dropped 2 guards watching it. I regretted that pretty quickly though, since another patrolling guard spotted the bodies.
Heads up, I got signs of possible hostiles. Copy that, we're ready for cover.
but I was still able to sneak into the estate without getting spotted. I found the intel I needed and made my escape with the helicopter. The intel told me that I needed to go to the Fen Bog testing zone next, so I located it, placed a marker, and headed off. I parked my chopper a decent distance away to be safe, then began heading down the hill to enter the compound. I got a little careless on the way though and took a few tumbles. Luckily I didn't sustain any injuries, but I did lose some stamina, which I replenished by taking a couple swigs from my canteen. Found a vantage point and started scouting. I spotted a bunch of intel, 2 of which were outside the main compound in a warehouse, only guarded by a single heavy gunner. The laptop inside happened to have the data I needed. But now the next objective was to destroy one of the drones in the base to obtain a GPS card. This would be impossible to do fully stealth, since drones explode when destroyed, but I had a plan to take it out quickly. I dropped the minigunner to make sure he didn't come after me later, and began my infiltration. I snuck past some more guards and eventually made it to the drone, but I realized there were actually 2 of them. To make this plan work, I had to use cloaking spray. I wanted to avoid using this ability as much as I could, because it does feel a little overpowered for stealth, but I figured it was alright to make a few exceptions here and there when absolutely necessary. So I walked up to the drones and planted 2 C4 charges on each one. They got alerted because of my footsteps, but they still couldn't see me. I detonated the charges to destroy both, then grabbed the intel. But I forgot about the exploding part. That was my first death on this run, a little embarrassing. But lucky for me, I managed to get the intel before I died, so it still counted. I respawned with the next objective ready to go, and the enemies were no longer alerted. I call it cheating, I don't care. I re-infiltrated the compound with relative ease, dropping a few enemies along the way. I also remembered that equipping NVGs commonly causes them to block your crosshairs when aiming in third person. An update is due out on November 12th to fix this issue, but I recorded everything before then. I eventually made it to the computer, uploaded the data, and began my extraction. I killed some more guys on my way out, and to my absolute delight found an attack helicopter just waiting for me to steal. So I yoinked it and headed off to the safe house. When I arrived, I realized why I've never gotten a pilot's license. My glorious machine of death and destruction was no more. I talked to Hill, then headed out in this pathetic vehicle. I cried the entire way to my next objective. My next objective was to infiltrate the Skell head office and find Jay Skell. Security was pretty light outside, so I walked right in, dropping 2 guards. I quickly found the entrance to an underground lab and headed in. This is when I started to realize just how important audio would be in this run. Having no minimap or enemy tagging meant that the only way to know if an enemy was around the corner was to listen for footsteps or dialogue. I cleared out a room with a bunch of guys in it, but got spotted in the process. But overall, it was pretty smooth sailing. I made it to a much larger open room with some wolves inside, so I carefully took them out using diving to my advantage. Had a couple close calls, but managed to make it through alive. So I found Skell and brought him back to Erewhon. My next target was Paula Madeira, but before I could go after her, I needed to find out where she was. The first step was reaching Madeira's house, which was located right here. I bailed out of the chopper and parachuted down since I actually started to get bored of flying choppers and wanted to use a ground vehicle for a while. I easily snuck into Madeira's home and grabbed some intel. Then I needed to go to her neighbor's house. and killed a bunch of enemies patrolling outside.
Hey, pal.
The next step was to head into the city to find more intel. Now, I knew this could get messy, so before heading out, I stopped at a nearby bivouac to progress time to night. This would help my stealth efforts quite a bit. I found a motorcycle nearby that I liberated from some evil civilians and began the drive. I got to the city after a bit of road tripping and found myself very upset that the biggest lights around here couldn't be shot out. And seeing as it's a city, there were lights all over the place. But I proceeded nonetheless, coming across a couple Sentinel guys interrogating a civilian. I took care of them and continued on my way. I needed to get past a drone to reach the city center, so I hopped into the water to see if I could hide from it, but unfortunately that wasn't enough. I shot it down, then hauled ass to make sure no Sentinel guards saw me, and managed to reach the center without getting made.
I'm looking for someone. Goes by the name of Daigoro. Know where I can find him?
After talking to a civilian, I then needed to interrogate a Sentinel soldier to figure out where a guy named Daigoro is. But this is when I realized a pretty big problem with this run. Since I can't tag enemies, the game doesn't tell me which soldiers can be interrogated and which ones cannot. So I grabbed the first guy I saw, but I wasn't careful enough, so I got spotted. I made a decent human shield while I shot the others with my pistol. Then I flanked around a building to become hidden. From there, it was pretty simple to kill the rest. Since you can't interrogate dead people, I headed down the street to where I thought I might find another Sentinel checkpoint. I dropped a sniper, then found a guy who could be interrogated, since they tend to go into a downed state when shot in the body. I cleared out the rest of the guys around me so it would be safe, then carried out the interrogation. And just like that, I knew where Daigoro was. I made it to the prison and began to scout the place out. There were a decent amount of guards patrolling around the outside, and not many ways to get in without being spotted. I carefully moved up, then found a spot next to the helipad that looked like I could climb on. But as soon as I got over the ledge, guards spotted me. All hell broke loose, and it didn't take long until I was gunned down. I still thought that might be the best point of entry, however. So on my second attempt, I went to the same place, but waited for the guard to turn away. Shot both guys by the stairs and moved the bodies out of the way, then walked right in the front door. Once inside, I hacked the computer at the front desk, then started moving deeper into the prison to find Daigoro. I snuck past a bunch more patrolling guards and found Daigoro at his cell. The next step was to extract him. I knew there was a helicopter out front the way I came in, so I let him back that way. We got spotted on the way out, but everything seemed alright since I was almost at the chopper. And that was when the fucking idiot ran into my bullets. On to my third attempt. Same deal, snuck through, got past the guards, but this time I didn't get spotted and I also didn't shoot Daigoro. Though I still contemplated doing it for the misery just put me through. I extracted him to a nearby safe house, then continued on to the next objective of finding civilians that can give me the location of Madeira, since we're still on that for some reason. This was probably the easiest part so far. I arrived at the village and quickly found a civvy to talk to. She gave me the location and I left. Easy as that. And finally, the mission I've been working towards this whole time. A little bit of scouting revealed some RPG guys up on the rooftops, and the location of Madeira's office. I would without a doubt have to get through this one quietly. There were simply too many enemies. I made my way down the terrain and cut a hole through the fence using my blowtorch. Since this area was so open and there were so many patrols around, I realized I couldn't kill anyone or else they'd definitely see the bodies and put the whole base on alert. So in my most careful stealthing yet, I began moving through the compound from cover to cover. After a bit of effort, I reached Madera's office. But before we could go, Madera needed me to plant detonators in their battery stocks to sabotage operations. A little more sneaking. Same deal. I was going to try to get through non-lethally, but I made a couple exceptions since they were inside of a building.
Shit.
I moved their bodies to the corner and continued on. I figured it would be a good idea to take out a couple targets now, since they would surely come after me later. But I made a bad judgment call and didn't account for a couple other guys. I got spotted and everyone came after me. The most intense gunfight yet began. I got back to Madera, who sustained an injury during a cutscene, so from there I had to carry her. During some earlier scouting, I had discovered a helicopter inside the base, so I knew that was the best way to get out, but getting there was easier said than done. I still had the rest of the base to deal with, and a squad of wolves had just arrived. I got insanely lucky and barely survived the ton of gunfire, and using only my pistol, I somehow killed the rest of the wolves. After that, I avoided the rest of the enemies looking for me, and I got Madera to the chopper. Brought her to the outcast hideout, and that was that. I figured that was a good place to call it quits, at least for the story. But there was one more thing that I wanted to try, and that was attacking an over-leveled base. As you probably already know, Breakpoint features a leveling and gear score system, but it's not quite the same as something like The Division. In this game, your gear score dictates which compounds and enemies you can attack effectively, but it's still always possible to kill any level enemies with a single headshot, and a slightly increased amount of body shots. The real difference is how much damage they do to you. I missed that guy during my scouting, and he shredded me almost instantly. If the rest of the game is extreme difficulty, then over-leveled compounds were absolute insanity. And since this playthrough only allows for one weapon, my gear score would always be low, since it factors in the empty rifle slot as a 0. So I respawned and went in again, just to see how viable this would be. I dropped a couple of guys, then moved in closer. Tried to kill 2 more, but misjudged my own damage and was instantly one-shotted by a shotgunner. For my third and final attempt, I wanted to see if it was possible to kill the drone patrolling the area. I thought it would go down quickly, but it did not, and I promptly met my end. And that was about the extent of my patience with this compound. So now that all that was complete, what did I learn? Well, you can obviously improve the gameplay quite a bit by playing this way. Stealth and combat are so much more engaging when you don't have wall hacks and literal win buttons. But this all required a lot of restraint, forcing myself not to buy better skills, order vehicles, or fast travel, even though all of those things were constantly sitting right in front of me. Plus, there's the issue of the RPG mechanics. Certain activities and missions let you ignore gear score and all that since the enemies don't have levels, but other areas are patrolled by enemies that are almost impossible to defeat unless you have spent all that time leveling up. The game is basically at war with itself, pulling you in different directions, not fully committing to any one. So no matter how much effort you put into changing the gameplay like I did, it still is fundamentally flawed. Though as my playtime indicates, I still do think this game is genuinely fun, but all the negative reviews are absolutely justified. It was a train wreck of a launch, but I do think that in time this game will improve, or at least I hope so. So until then, if you still want to enjoy the game but the new design decisions are holding you back, maybe this will have helped. I'd like to hear about your experiences in the comments. So thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.